I can still hear the rain from that night, the way it pressed against those old windows like something trying to get in, or maybe trying to keep us from getting out. The apartment was on the fourth floor of a building that had seen better decades, and the storm made the glass shake in its frames with each gust of wind. I stood there in the center of that sparsely furnished room, my coat still heavy with dampness from the walk up from the street, my hand gripping the doorframe, as if it might steady more than just my body. The room felt smaller than it had an hour before. A desk pushed against the far wall, a single lamp casting uneven light across worn hardwood floors, a bookshelf half empty and leaning slightly to one side. Everything about the space seemed temporary, as though Julian had never quite decided to fully inhabit it. But then again, that had always been his way, even in college, existing in the spaces between certainty and possibility. He stood across from me, leaning against the desk with his arms crossed, and I noticed how the storm seemed to stop at the windows. Inside, the air hung perfectly still, thick with the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. His eyes hadn't left mine since I'd walked through the door, and there was something in his expression I couldn't name then, but recognized now as the look of a man who had made a decision. Julian spoke first, his voice lower than usual, carrying a tremor I'd never heard before. He said he didn't want anyone else here. Not tonight. Not ever, really. The words hung in the air between us like smoke, and I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of something I'd kept tightly wound for 17 years of marriage, for decades of carefully constructed normalcy. I heard the lock click. Such a small sound, barely audible over the rain, but it seemed to echo in that quiet room like a stone dropped into still water. He had turned the key without looking away from me, and in that gesture was both a warning and an invitation, a line being drawn and crossed simultaneously. I understood, even then, that whatever happened next would be something I could never take back, never explain away as a moment of confusion or weakness. My feet remained planted on those weathered floorboards, but everything else about me felt unmoored. The clock on the wall ticked with the kind of aggressive precision that makes time feel elastic and urgent all at once. Outside, the storm was swallowing the city whole, turning the world beyond those windows into something distant and irrelevant. But inside, in that small room with its temporary furniture and permanent shadows, I felt more present than I had in years. I could see the tension in Julian's hands, the way his fingers pressed against the edge of the desk behind him. I could feel the weight of my own hands, still damp from the rain, still carrying the memory of the wedding ring I had slipped into my pocket before climbing those 4 flights of stairs. The space between us felt both infinite and non-existent, a distance that could be crossed in 3 steps or might take the rest of my life to bridge. Neither of us moved. We simply stood there, 2 men in a room above a sleeping city, while the storm pressed against the windows and the clock marked time we both knew we were running out of. I think I knew, even then, that this was the moment everything would change, that I was standing at the edge of my old life, looking across at the possibility of something I had never allowed myself to imagine. To understand how I came to be standing in that room, you have to understand the life I was living before that storm. 17 years of marriage to Elise, 17 years of carefully constructed normalcy in a modest colonial house on Maple Street, in a town so quiet that sirens still make people look up from their morning coffee. Our home was a testament to order, to the kind of meticulous care that comes from having too much time and too little to say to each other. Elise dusted the shelves every Thursday. The same 3 framed photographs had occupied the same spots on the mantel for over a decade. Our wedding day, a vacation to Cape Cod from 8 years ago, and a picture of her parents that I sometimes forgot was there. The walls were painted in shades that real estate agents call warm, but always struck me as the color of resignation. Beige in the living room, pale yellow in the kitchen, a gray so soft it barely qualified as color in our bedroom. I taught literature at the regional high school, where I had built a reputation for patience and calm that felt more like a costume I wore than anything resembling my actual personality. My students liked me well enough, though I sometimes caught them looking at me with the kind of curiosity reserved for museum displays. Mr. Richards, the teacher who always had time to listen, who never raised his voice, who seemed to float through his days with the unflappable demeanor of someone who had found peace with his circumstances. But peace, I was learning, was not the same thing as contentment. At home, silence had become our primary language. Dinner happened at 6 o'clock every evening at the same oak table her grandmother had left us. Conversations following the predictable circuit of grocery lists, utility bills, and observations about the weather. We had perfected the art of sharing space without sharing anything that mattered. I would grade papers while she watched television. She would read her mystery novels while I prepared lessons for the next day. We moved around each other with the practiced efficiency of roommates who had long ago exhausted their interest in each other's inner lives. The photograph changed everything, though I didn't recognize it at the time. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late March, the kind of gray New England day that makes you forget the sun ever existed. I was sorting through a box of donated books in the school library, separating the usable texts from the ones too worn or outdated to keep. Most of the donations were the usual suspects: romance novels with cracked spines, outdated computer manuals, the occasional literary classic that someone had decided they no longer needed. But tucked inside a collection of 20th century poetry, pressed between pages that smelled of lavender and thyme, I found a black and white photograph. Two men standing close enough that their shoulders touched, their faces turned slightly toward each other with expressions that were careful but unmistakably tender. There was something in their posture, in the way one man's hand rested just barely against the other's arm, that spoke of intimacy held in check, of love that had to be guarded even in private moments. I should have left it in the book, should have donated the entire collection without a second thought. Instead, I slipped the photograph into my coat pocket and carried it home, where it remained hidden in the drawer of my desk like evidence of a crime I hadn't yet committed. That night, lying in bed beside Elise while she read another paperback mystery, I found myself thinking about those two men. Who they were, when the photograph had been taken, whether they had been allowed to love each other openly or had been forced to exist in the spaces between what they wanted and what the world would permit them to have. I wondered if they had ever stood in rooms like the one I would find myself in months later, weighing the cost of honesty against the safety of silence. The photograph became a talisman of sorts, a reminder that other ways of living were possible, even if I couldn't yet imagine what they might look like in my own life. I would take it out sometimes when I was alone in my classroom after school, studying the faces of those two men as if they might offer me some guidance I didn't know I was seeking. Spring moved into summer with the kind of relentless predictability that had come to define my existence. The same morning routine, the same drive to work, the same careful conversations over dinner. But something had shifted, some small crack in the foundation of my contentment that grew wider each day. I began to notice things I had trained myself to overlook. The way Elise and I could spend entire evenings in the same room without really seeing each other. The way my own voice sounded hollow when I spoke about plans for the future we were supposedly building together. I was 43 years old, and I was beginning to understand that I had been living someone else's version of my life for so long that I had almost forgotten there might be other possibilities. The photograph in my desk drawer reminded me daily that love could look different than what I had known, that passion and tenderness could exist in forms I had never allowed myself to consider. I just didn't know yet that everything was about to change. The email arrived on a Thursday morning in early September, buried among the usual digital debris of faculty meetings and automated reminders. Alumni Weekend Art Exhibition, the subject line read, and my first instinct was to delete it without opening. I had never been one for reunions or alumni events, preferring to let college remain a distant chapter one had no interest in revisiting. But something made me pause. Maybe it was the photograph still hidden in my desk drawer, or the way the morning light was falling through my classroom windows with the particular slant that meant summer was ending. I opened the email and scanned the details. A gallery showing in the city, an hour-and-a-half drive from home, featuring works by graduates from the last 25 years. the kind of event that would normally hold no appeal for me whatsoever. Then I saw the name, Julian Whitmore, listed among the featured artists like a signature on a letter I had been waiting years to receive. Julian. I hadn't thought about him in so long that seeing his name felt like remembering a dream. We had known each other briefly during my junior year, one of those college friendships that burn bright and brief before circumstances pull you in different directions. He was an art major, intense and quiet, with dark hair that always looked like he had been running his hands through it and eyes that seemed to see things the rest of us missed. I remembered the day he had sketched my portrait without asking. I had been sitting in the campus coffee shop, reading for my American literature seminar, when I looked up to find him watching me from across the room, his pencil moving steadily across a small pad of paper. When I approached his table, curious and slightly embarrassed, he had shown me the drawing, my face rendered in careful lines, capturing something I didn't recognize as myself, but somehow knew was true. He had given me the sketch without explanation, then disappeared from my life as suddenly as he had entered it. I heard later that he had transferred to another school, pursuing opportunities that our small college couldn't provide. I kept the sketch for years, tucked in textbooks and later in the back of desk drawers, until one day during my early marriage when I had thrown it away in a fit of organization that now felt like self-erasure. The gallery opening was scheduled for the following Friday evening. As I read the details, I could already hear Elise's objections forming in my mind. It was far from home, would require an overnight stay in the city, and she had always disliked it when I was away, even for school-related travel. We had settled into a routine that discouraged spontaneity, where any deviation from our established patterns required negotiation and justification. But something about seeing Julian's name on that list of artists made me feel reckless in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I printed the email and took it home, where I mentioned it to Elise over dinner as casually as I could manage. I told her it was a school fundraiser, a professional development opportunity that might benefit my students. The lies came easier than I expected, sliding off my tongue with the smooth efficiency of someone who had been practicing deception without realizing it. She agreed with the kind of distracted consent that suggested she wasn't really listening, already absorbed in plans for her book club meeting and a weekend of reorganizing the guest room closet. I felt a stab of guilt at how easily she accepted my fabrication, followed immediately by a surge of something that might have been relief. The week that followed moved with agonizing slowness. I found myself checking the gallery's website repeatedly, looking at the brief artist statements and preview images. Julian's bio was sparse. He lived in the city now, had been painting professionally for over a decade, specialized in portraits and urban landscapes. There was a small photo of him, older now, but unmistakably the same person who had once drawn my face with such careful attention. Friday evening arrived gray and humid, with the promise of rain hanging in the air like a held breath. I told Elise I would call her when I arrived at my hotel, kissed her goodbye with the same perfunctory affection that had characterized our farewells for years, and drove toward the city with my heart beating in a rhythm I didn't recognize. The gallery was in a converted warehouse district, all exposed brick and industrial lighting that made the artwork glow against the dark walls. When I walked through the doors, I was immediately enveloped by the warmth of bodies and conversation, the smell of wine mixing with the faint scent of rain that people had carried in from the street. The space was crowded with the kind of cultural enthusiasts who attended such events. Well-dressed couples discussing composition and color theory, younger artists clutching plastic wine glasses, and networking with practiced intensity. I moved through the crowd slowly, studying the paintings and sculptures while scanning the room for a face I might recognize. And then, across the main gallery space, I saw him. Julian stood beside a large canvas, talking to a small group of admirers, and the 20 years that had passed since college collapsed into nothing. He was older, his dark hair now touched with gray at the temples, lines around his eyes that spoke of time and experience. But when he laughed at something one of his companions said, I recognized the gesture immediately. The way his head tilted slightly to one side, the quiet intensity that had always made him seem like he was listening to something the rest of US couldn't hear. As if sensing my presence, he looked up and our eyes met across the crowded room. For a moment, everything else fell away. The conversations, the clinking of wine glasses, the gentle hum of appreciation for art. There was a stillness in his expression, a recognition that seemed to travel across the space between us like a message sent in a language only we understood. He excused himself from his group and began walking toward me, and I felt my pulse falter the way it had all those years ago when he would appear unexpectedly in doorways or across campus quads. Some things, I realized, time could not diminish. He reached me before I could decide whether to stay or flee, and when Julian spoke my name, it sounded different than it had in years. Not the perfunctory way Elise said it over breakfast or the professional courtesy my colleagues offered in faculty meetings, but something warmer, more deliberate, as if he had been saving it all this time and was finally allowed to use it again. We talked for a while beside his paintings, catching up on the surface details that fill the space between strangers who used to know each other. But the gallery was too warm, too crowded, and when the rain that had been threatening all evening finally began to fall, Julian suggested we walk rather than stand in the noise of other people's conversations. We stepped out into the night, and I felt the cool dampness settle on my skin like a benediction. The streets glistened under the streetlights, and Julian seemed to know exactly where he was going, leading me through a maze of narrow blocks until we found ourselves at a small cafe that stayed open late for the artists and insomniacs who populated this part of the city. The place was nearly empty, just us and a couple of students hunched over laptops in the corner, the kind of refuge where time moves differently and conversations can unfold without the pressure of clocks or obligations. We ordered coffee that grew cold while we talked, and I found myself remembering how easy it had been to be around Julian in college, how he had a way of listening that made you hear your own voice differently. He told me about his life in the years since we had known each other, how he had moved to the city after finishing his degree at another school, how he had spent his 20s struggling to make art while working restaurant jobs and freelance graphic design. Now he lived alone in a small loft a few blocks away, painting portraits and city scenes that galleries were finally beginning to notice. His life sounded both solitary and purposeful in ways that made my own existence feel suddenly cramped. When the cafe owner began stacking chairs around us, we realized we had been talking for hours. Julian walked me back to my car, and as I drove the hour and a half home through the empty highways, I felt something shifting inside me, like a door that had been locked for years was finally being opened from the inside. Over the weeks that followed, I found reasons to drive back to the city. A conference on modern teaching methods that I discovered online. An errand to a bookstore that supposedly had a rare edition I needed for my American literature class. Professional development opportunities that I had never shown interest in before, but suddenly seemed essential to my growth as an educator. Julian was always available when I called, and we fell into a pattern of meeting in the late afternoons when my obligations were finished and the city was settling into its evening rhythm. We would walk along the river as the sun set, or spend hours in the old bookstores that lined the university district, browsing through collections of poetry and philosophy while rain tapped against tall windows. He listened to me talk about my students, my frustrations with the school administration, my complicated relationship with literature that I loved, but felt I was teaching badly. I heard myself saying things I had never articulated before, thoughts and feelings that had been buried under years of routine and compromise. Julian had a way of asking questions that didn't feel like interrogation, but like genuine curiosity about who I was underneath the careful performance I had been giving for so long. At home, the changes were subtle but impossible to ignore. Elise noticed my distraction first, the way I would stare out windows during dinner or forget to respond when she asked about my day. She mentioned it with the kind of mild irritation usually reserved for misplaced keys or unexpected bills, but I could hear something else underneath her complaints. A recognition that I was becoming someone she didn't quite recognize. My students began commenting on my improved mood, though I insisted I was simply sleeping better. There was truth in that, actually. For the first time in years, I found myself looking forward to each day, wondering what Julian and I might discover in our conversations, what books we might find in those dusty shops, what parts of the city we might explore together. I told myself these meetings were harmless, that Julian was simply an old friend who had re-entered my life at a time when I needed intellectual stimulation and adult conversation that went beyond grocery lists and weather reports. I convinced myself that the warmth I felt when I saw his number on my phone was nothing more than the pleasure of good company. But I knew I was lying. I knew it in the way my pulse quickened when he smiled, in the careful attention I paid to what I wore on the days I planned to see him, in the stories I invented for Elise about where I had been and why I was coming home later than expected. I was 43 years old, and for the first time since college, I felt like I was becoming someone I might actually want to be. On a Tuesday evening in late October, Julian asked if I wanted to see his studio. We had been walking along the river as we often did, watching the last light fade from the water and the city lights begin to claim the darkness. The question was asked casually, almost as an afterthought, but I heard something beneath it that made my chest tighten with a mixture of anticipation and fear. His building was one of those converted warehouses that artists had claimed in the decades when this part of the city was still affordable and raw. We climbed 3 flights of stairs, past doors marked with numbers painted in fading black letters, the smell of turpentine and coffee growing stronger with each floor. Julian's studio was at the end of a narrow hallway, behind a door he unlocked with a key that looked older than either of us. The space took my breath away. It was a tall room with windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, looking out over the city's glittering sprawl. The floors were wide planks of wood, stained and scarred by years of creative work, paint ground into the grain like a record of every canvas that had been born here. Easels stood at various angles, some holding works in progress, others empty and waiting. The air was thick with the smell of oil paint and possibility. But it was the far wall that stopped me cold. There, hanging like a window into some alternate version of my life, was a large canvas, an unfinished portrait that I recognized immediately, though I had never seen it before. It was me, rendered in the same posture as the photograph I had discovered months ago in that donated poetry book. The same tilt of head, the same careful expression, the same sense of someone caught in a moment of unguarded contemplation. I heard my own voice, barely above a whisper. I said that he had kept it, though I wasn't entirely sure what I meant. Julian moved closer, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to fill the room. He told me he had painted it from memory, working from an image that had been lodged in his mind for over 20 years. That the photograph I had found was his, taken during one of our afternoons in college when I wasn't paying attention, when I was lost in a book and he was lost in watching me read. The realization hit me like a physical blow. All these months, I had been carrying his photograph in my pocket, studying the faces of strangers and wondering about their story, never understanding that I was looking at myself through his eyes. That someone had been seeing me, really seeing me, even when I thought I was invisible. Julian stepped closer, close enough that I could see the paint stains on his fingers, the way his shirt was rumpled from a day of work. The city hummed below us, a distant symphony of traffic and voices and life continuing its relentless forward motion. But inside that studio, time seemed to slow and thicken like honey. He reached toward my face, his fingers brushing a strand of hair back from my forehead. Such a simple gesture, the kind of casual touch that happens between friends, between people who are comfortable with each other. But his hand lingered, his palm coming to rest against my cheek, and I felt something fundamental shift in the space between us. I should have stepped back, should have made some excuse about getting home, about Elise expecting me, about the careful life I had built that depended on maintaining certain boundaries. Instead, I found myself leaning into his touch, my eyes closing as if I could shut out the implications of what was happening. When I opened them again, Julian was watching me with an expression I had never seen before. Not the casual friendship we had been maintaining these past weeks, not the nostalgic warmth of college acquaintances reconnecting. This was something else entirely, something raw and honest and terrifying in its intensity. The kiss, when it came, was neither hesitant nor urgent. It was inevitable, like water finding its level or seasons changing. His lips against mine felt like the answer to a question I had been afraid to ask, like coming home to a place I had never known I was looking for. For a moment that lasted both forever and no time at all, I felt the years fall away. All the dinners eaten in careful silence. All the conversations about weather and bills and the safe, small concerns that had filled my days. All the mornings I had woken up next to someone who knew my habits, but not my dreams. All the nights I had fallen asleep wondering if this was all there was to living. In Julian's arms, I understood for the first time what I had been missing. This was what love could feel like when it wasn't filtered through obligation and compromise, when it was allowed to exist in its full, complicated, dangerous beauty. This was what it meant to be seen not just as a husband or a teacher or a reliable presence in someone else's life, but as myself, whoever that might turn out to be. But understanding and accepting are different things entirely. When we finally broke apart, I felt the weight of my other life crashing back over me like a wave. The house on Maple Street, the 17 years of marriage, the carefully constructed identity I had built and that everyone expected me to maintain. Julian's studio suddenly felt like a cocoon I would have to emerge from, and I wasn't sure I was brave enough to spread whatever wings I might discover. Julian seemed to understand my silence. He didn't push for words or promises or explanations. Instead, he handed me a cup of coffee and stood beside me at the window, both of us looking out at the city lights as if they might offer some guidance for what came next. The truth was, I was terrified, not of Julian, not of what I was feeling, but of everything that feeling might require me to give up or become. I was 43 years old, and I was just beginning to understand that I had been living someone else's version of my life for so long that I wasn't sure I remembered who I actually was underneath all the performance. But I also knew, standing there in that paint-scented room with Julian's warmth still lingering on my skin, that there was no going back to not knowing. The door had been opened, and I could feel the light pouring through. The distance between Elise and me became impossible to ignore in the weeks that followed. It wasn't that we fought. We had never been the kind of couple who raised voices or slammed doors. Instead, there was a careful politeness that felt more devastating than anger, a way of moving around each other that acknowledged something had fundamentally shifted without naming what it was. She noticed everything. The way I stared at my phone during dinner, waiting for messages that might or might not come. How I had started taking longer routes home from school, sometimes arriving an hour later than usual with vague explanations about errands or traffic. The careful attention I now paid to my appearance on certain mornings, choosing clothes with a consciousness I hadn't felt in years. It was a Thursday night in November when she finally confronted me. I was grading papers at the kitchen table, but my focus kept drifting to my phone, which had been silent all day. Julian had mentioned he was preparing for another exhibition, and our usual afternoon conversations had become less frequent. I found myself missing him with an intensity that frightened me. Elise appeared in the doorway, still in her robe though it was nearly 10 o'clock. She looked smaller than usual, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were cold. When she spoke, her voice was sharp but trembling, like a blade that had been honed too thin. She said she didn't know who I was anymore, that for months I had been like a stranger living in our house, going through the motions of our life while clearly wishing I was somewhere else. She asked if there was someone else, if that was why I had become so distant, so distracted, so obviously unhappy with the life we had built together. I set down my pen and looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in longer than I could remember. Elise was 41 years old, with laugh lines around her eyes and gray beginning to thread through her brown hair. She was a good person who had never asked for anything more than the quiet, predictable life we had created. She deserved honesty, or at least as much honesty as I was capable of giving. I told her there wasn't someone else, not in the way she meant. But I admitted that something in me had changed, something I couldn't explain or understand fully myself. I said I felt like I had been sleepwalking through my own life for years, and that I was finally beginning to wake up, but I didn't know what that meant for us or for the future we had planned. She asked me if I still loved her, and the question hung in the air between us like smoke. I wanted to say yes, wanted to offer her the comfort of certainty she was looking for. But I found myself thinking about love in ways I never had before, about the difference between caring for someone and being in love with them, between commitment and passion, between the life you choose and the life that chooses you. I told her I would always care about her, that she was important to me in ways that went deeper than romance. But I also said I wasn't sure I knew what love was supposed to feel like anymore, and that pretending otherwise wouldn't be fair to either of us. She began to cry then, quietly, and I felt something break inside me that I knew would never heal completely. We had been married for 17 years, and in that moment, I understood that we were both grieving the end of something that had been over long before either of us was willing to admit it. The next few days passed in a strange suspension, as if we were both waiting for something to happen that would make the path forward clear. Elise moved through the house with a careful dignity that made me ashamed of my own relief. We spoke when necessary, maintained the surface routines of our shared life, but underneath it all was the understanding that we were already beginning to let each other go. It was during this liminal time that Julian called and asked me to come to the city. He said he had something he needed to tell me, something that couldn't wait for our usual careful scheduling. I invented another conference, another professional obligation, and drove toward the city through an afternoon that was growing dark with the promise of another storm. When I arrived at his building, Julian was waiting for me in his studio, but something was different about him. There was a tension in his posture, a directness in his gaze that I hadn't seen before. The casual friendship we had been maintaining, the careful boundaries we had established since that night we kissed, seemed to have evaporated. He asked me to sit down, then remained standing himself, pacing between the windows and his easels like someone who had been rehearsing a speech but had forgotten the words. Finally, he stopped and looked at me directly, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to fill the room. He said he couldn't continue the way we had been, meeting like old friends when we both knew this was something else entirely. He said he was tired of pretending that what was happening between us was casual or temporary, tired of acting like we had all the time in the world to figure out what we meant to each other. Then he asked me the question that would change everything. He said he needed to know if I wanted to stay where I was, in what he called my half-life, or if I wanted to be seen for who I really was, even if that meant giving up the safety of the life I had always known. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke as he spoke, rain lashing against the tall windows with the kind of intensity that makes you aware of how fragile the barriers are between inside and outside, between safety and exposure. The city below us glowed wet and electric in the darkness, and I felt like I was standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. I stood up and moved toward the windows, watching the water stream down the glass in patterns that seemed to shift and change with each gust of wind. Julian came to stand behind me, close enough that I could feel his warmth, but not quite touching. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, watching the storm transform the city into something wild and beautiful and dangerous. When I finally turned around, Julian was watching me with an expression I recognized from that first night in his studio, when everything between us had shifted from friendship into something deeper and more complicated. The air in the room felt charged, electric with possibility and fear and the weight of decisions that couldn't be unmade. That was when he spoke the words that had brought me here, to this moment that felt like the center of everything. He said he didn't want anyone else here, his voice low and unsteady in a way that made me understand this was as frightening for him as it was for me. And then I heard the quiet click of the lock, that small sound that seemed to echo in the storm-filled room like a stone dropped into still water. I stood there in the center of that sparsely furnished room, my coat still damp from the rain, my hand gripping the door frame, as if it might steady more than just my body. Neither of us moved, but everything had changed. The space between us felt both infinite and non-existent, a distance that could be crossed in 3 steps or might take the rest of my life to bridge. The storm pressed against the windows, and I knew that whatever happened next would be something I could never take back, never explain away as a moment of confusion or weakness. I was 43 years old, and I was finally being asked to choose who I wanted to be. Morning came in pale gray light, filtered through windows still streaked with rain from the storm that had finally exhausted itself sometime before dawn. I sat on Julian's floor, my back against the wall beneath those tall windows, watching the slow drip of water from the window ledge. Each drop caught the weak sunlight for a moment before falling, and I found myself counting them like a meditation, like a way of marking time in a world that suddenly felt completely new. My coat lay folded beside me, and my wedding ring rested on the edge of Julian's paint-splattered table where I had placed it sometime during the night. It was just a small circle of gold, no wider than my thumb, but it seemed absurdly heavy for its size, as if it contained the weight of 17 years of mornings when I had slipped it onto my finger without thinking, 17 years of nights when I had placed it on the nightstand beside a bed I shared with someone who knew my habits but had never known my heart. Outside, the city was stirring awake. I could hear the distant hum of traffic beginning to build, the occasional voice of someone walking past on the street below, the everyday sounds of a world continuing its forward motion while I sat in this room, feeling like everything I had ever known about myself was being quietly rearranged. I hadn't decided what would come next. Whether I would go home to the house on Maple Street, whether home was still a place I belonged, whether there was a way to bridge the distance between the person I had been yesterday and whoever I was becoming in the pale light of this new day. The questions felt enormous and impossibly simple all at once. Julian moved quietly around the room, and I watched him from my place on the floor with the kind of attention I usually reserved for beautiful things I wasn't sure I was allowed to touch. He was making coffee, the ordinary ritual of measuring and pouring that people perform in the morning without thinking. But somehow, in this context, after this night, even the simplest gestures felt charged with meaning. He didn't speak, didn't ask me how I was feeling or what I was thinking or what I planned to do next. There was a gentleness in his silence that told me he understood this was not a time for words, that whatever was happening inside me needed space to unfold without the pressure of explanation or decision. I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of coffee pouring into the cup, that simplest, most ordinary sound that people hear in kitchens all over the world every morning of their lives. But sitting there in Julian's studio, surrounded by the smell of paint and possibility, it sounded different than it ever had before. It sounded like the beginning of something I had been waiting for my entire life without knowing I was waiting. When I opened my eyes again, Julian was sitting on the floor beside me, 2 cups of coffee steaming in the space between us. He didn't hand me one or ask if I wanted it. He simply placed it within reach and settled back against the wall, both of us looking out at the city as it slowly came alive in the morning light. The silence stretched between us, comfortable and full of unspoken understanding. I thought about Elise, probably waking up alone in our bed, wondering if I was coming home. I thought about my students, who would see me in a few hours and might notice something different in my face, some change I wouldn't be able to hide. I thought about the careful life I had built, brick by brick, over 4 decades of trying to be the person I thought I was supposed to be. But mostly, I thought about the feeling of Julian's hand on my face the night we first kissed, and how it had felt like being recognized by someone who had been looking for me for a very long time. I thought about the portrait he had painted from memory, about the photograph I had carried in my pocket for months without understanding I was carrying a piece of my own story. I picked up the coffee cup and felt its warmth against my palms. Through the window, I could see people beginning to appear on the sidewalks below, each of them carrying their own stories, their own secrets, their own quiet revolutions that no one else would ever fully understand. I was 43 years old, and I was sitting on the floor of a room that smelled like turpentine and possibility, watching the morning light transform everything it touched. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but for the first time in longer than I could remember, that uncertainty felt like freedom rather than fear. The beginning of something new is often quiet, I realized. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare or drama. It simply arrives in the pale light of an ordinary morning, in the space between one breath and the next, in the moment when you finally stop pretending to be someone you never were and allow yourself to become who you might actually be.